Hello everyone, thank you for clicking on this video. So in this video I'll be showing a process to build a simple web application in ASP.NET Core. I'll be using pre-built ReactJs template to build frontend, and I'll be using Azure services to publish it, and I'll be using Azure text analytics as well. And to show data, I'll be using ReactJs chart 2 as well. So just to give you an overview of this application, this project is going to be a simple two-page web application. In the main page, there will basically be a form with 3 questions, and users can submit their answers, and those answers will go through Azure text analytics, which will tell if the text is positive, negative, or neutral sentiment. And after that, I'll basically show the stats on a stats page. The stats page will have a ReactJs chart, and that will basically show the number of negative, positive, or neutral responses that user put in. And as a disclaimer, I just want to say that this is not a tutorial. I mean, I've worked on .NET Core before, but I don't want to act like this is the best way to do things. I'm just trying to showcase what I do and what problems I have faced while making these applications. So let's get on it. I started with creating ASP.NET Core web application in Visual Studios. For templates, I used ReactJs. When you create a project in Visual Studios, everything is basically set up, and the project comes with its own controller, model, and a couple of pages made using ReactJs. I didn't want to fiddle around with creating a project from the ground up, so I just chose to make use of the template and change a few files. So this is the built-in template. This app just has a landing page and navbar that redirects to different pages. So the landing page calls index.js, which has app component in it, and app.js has layout component, which wraps routes to all other pages. So to make my app work, all I had to do was import my components in app.js file and add them inside layout component. So to create my landing page, I added a JavaScript file and named it main.js. So inside main.js, I imported React and component from React library that came with the project, and created my HTML components. Then I also added Bootstrap because I wanted to decorate my form up to some extent. So the landing page of the app has a form with 3 questions. I wanted people to have subjective answers, so I chose questions like, how was your week? What was your story? So yeah, while I was writing my code, I had a huge brain fart and ended up with 2 how was your week question. And since I was really bored, and that was my second time making this app, so I decided just to leave it as is. Next thing I did was imported my main component from main.js inside app.js, and instead of home I added main as the landing page. I also removed routes to fetch data and counter page since I really didn't need them. And running the app, you could see there is the form with 3 questions and text boxes for user inputs. So as you saw before, there was a navigation bar that led to nowhere. So next thing I had to do was take it out. I went to layout.js file and removed nav menu component, which included elements for nav bar. So the next thing I did was create a model named user contents. Since there were 3 responses from users, I needed 3 strings to hold each responses and pass them into Azure text analytics and get back the sentiments of those responses. And I also wanted to save sentiments for future retrieval to display a stats in the chart. So I needed 3 sentiment strings as well. I could have probably used an enum object instead of using strings, but for this purpose, strings work just fine. So after creating the model, I had to create a class that extended DB context, which had DB set of type user contents. And next thing to do was initialize DB context in start.cs. So inside configuration service, I added service.addDBContext, which takes connection strings to connect to database. By the way, if you find error trying to use SQL Server, all you have to do is install entity framework core.sql server from NuGet package manager, and when you do that, make sure you uncheck include pre-release. So in order to connect to database, I had to create a database first. I had SQL Server installed and running, so all I had to do was go to SQL Server Object Explorer and select my server and create a new database. I called it React Proto, and from properties section I grabbed the connection string and added the string in application.json file under connection strings and named the connection string default connection. And later I called the DB string inside use SQL Server while initializing DB context. So after setting up database, I tried to create migration. In package manager, I typed add migration and gave it a name initial migration, but it threw an error. It was because you have to install entity framework core .tools from NuGet package manager to be able to use migration. So after installing the package, I could add migration without problem. Adding migration creates a migration folder and a file corresponding to the migration. If the migration has changes, you will see the detail in migration files. If not, the migration file will be empty. So after creating migration, I had to do was update database. Doing so created a table named after the model with rows corresponding to the fields in that model. Next step was to create a controller to handle user requests. Again, this app basically lets user to post their answers, and those answers are later fetched to show the stats on the bar chart in stats page. So I created a controller, named it main controller, which handled posting and retrieving of user data. So in the main controller, I created a method called getData, which grabs all data from the database. And I also created another method called postData, which takes user contents model object as parameter, which is passed in from the form I made in main.js. Inside postData, I created a new user contents object using the parameters passed in from the form and saved it to the database. Next, I had to add a method in main.js to call the postData method when the form was submitted to save the form data. So in main.js, I get names to each input fields that needed to be passed in as parameters and saved it to database such as username and user answers. And then I created a function named postData, which took event as a parameter. Here I created an object with same fields as user content and gave the value from the form using data.get and passing in the name of the input I had assigned earlier. I did not declare what data was, but you will see me initialize data later. It is, in this context, data is just form data. Then using fetch, I called the method from controller. Since it's a post method, I used post as well method. Shit. And if the request was successful, it would console.log post success and redirect to stats page. If not, then the app would throw an error. And later I assigned postData function to unsubmit event and passed event as a parameter inside the form element. So running the application, yeah, you can see the form. It's got username and 3 questions and text field. And if I press submit and go to console, it says post success. And if I go back to my application, my project, and see my database, you can see that the post was successful and data was saved to the database. So before creating stats page, I wanted to use text analytics to process user input and save their sentiments into the database. So when I retrieve data from backend, I could display them in a bar chart. I used Azure Text Analytics API to do sentiment detection. As you can see, it does a pretty decent job of understanding the sentiment of the text. So in order to be able to use an Azure Text Analytics API, you got to set up an Azure account. All I had to do was sign in to Azure portal with your Microsoft account. So after signing into Azure, I went to portal and created a resource group and named it ReactJs temp. I set everything to default and pressed create. And you're just gonna see me struggle here to find out where my resource went. So all I had to do was press refresh, and yeah, there it was. Then inside resource group, I added a new text analytics resource and named it text check react. Chose free pricing tier and the resource group I had recently created. In order to use this API, you need API key and URI endpoint. So next thing I had to do was go to overview of text analytics resource and get keys and the endpoint. And back in main controller, following the documentations, I added private Azure key credential and URI fields. Azure key credential, it takes an API key, whereas URI takes your endpoint. To use Azure key credential, I had to install azure.core from NuGet package. And in order to be able to use Text Analytics API, you have to install Azure AI Text from NuGet Package Manager, but this time make sure to select Include Pre-Release. So back in my controller, I copied API key and my endpoint URL from Azure and pasted it. Then I created a method called sentiment, which took a string as a parameter, and inside the method I created a new text analytics client, and I created a document sentiment object that held the results gotten after the API did its sentiment analysis, and I also created a feedback string that held the actual sentiment value gotten after API calculation. So inside post data method above, I called sentiment method and passed in user sentiment as parameter, which is wrong, and I eventually got stuck on problem related to that issue. So then I ran the project and filled in all the user answers, and when I pressed submit, it threw an error. So what happened was, instead of passing in user's answer, I passed in user's text sentiment, which, if you saw my main.js file, is an empty string. So when you pass in an empty string as a text to analyze sentiment on, the API throws an error. And after fixing the error, I filled out the answers and the API returned results. And later, checking the database, you can also see that the user answers were saved along with their corresponding sentiments that was returned by the API. Next thing I did was add a stats page, but for some reason I just struggled to find JavaScript file to add. After struggling for quite a while, I found a JavaScript and added a stats.js page. So inside the stats page, I wanted to add a bar chart, and for that I used ReactJs chart 2. What I found out was installing ReactJs chart is a little iffy if you use ReactJs template that ASP.NET Core comes with. The good thing is the developers have all the documentations down, so it was fairly easy to follow up, but the only problem was installing it in ASP.NET Core. So my first try was just copying the npm command and typing that inside package manager console, and when I did that, it threw an error. The error was that it could not find package.json file in the project directory. So what I did, I don't think it's an optimal way to solve this problem, but it is the way that worked for me. So what I did was open command prompt and went to my project directory and ran the npm init command to initialize package.json file. After running npm init command, it asks you what you want to name your package. I just wrote package because I did not know if npm would be able to find another package name, and the rest of the field I just kept them default. And after doing that, I went back to my project and I ran npm command to install the chart, and it did give me some errors telling me that I should install other dependencies myself, but it works alright, trust me. I went back to documentations and copied a few codes to get the bar chart working. If you look at the right side, you can see the bar chart that will be displaying the stats. So in order to get that, what I did was created a constructor and added 4 arrays. First dataset had all answers for first question. Second dataset had all answers for second question, and so on. And user content had all user data gotten from API. And then I set up labels and datasets for the chart. Then in component did mount, I used fetch again to call data from backend. After fetching all data, I set user content to data and created arrays to hold answers to first, second, and third questions, and arrays to hold positive, negative, and neutral sentiment for each of the responses. So I had 3 arrays for each questions and 3 sentiments per one questions. As a result, I had 9 arrays to hold sentiments. I know, it makes no sense. Anyways, I was coding and I just got lost and forgot to record at that point, but I will go through what I did. So in the constructor, I basically set data for the chart. First dataset had all responses for first answer, second dataset had all neutral responses, and third dataset had all responses for your third answer. For example, negative answer for first answer was sent to sentiment 1n. Positive answer for first answer was added to sentiment 1p, and neutral answer was added to sentiment 1nt. And then I added all responses to their respective array, sorted by their sentiment. All sentiment arrays went to data array first, sentiment 2s went to data array second, and sentiment 3s went to data array third, and I set state of those previous arrays. Next, I needed the application to get redirected to stats page I just created, so I went to app.js file and imported a stats component from stats.js and added a route to it inside the layout component. Here I ran the application and filled in all the user inputs that user would usually put, and when I press submit, the bar chart did not show any data. The problem was that I did a real pro move of setting data to null array when the component first mounted. I changed that so the chart would show results for third answer for debug purpose. After digging for a little bit, I found out that I was trying to compare fields that did not exist to the type of sentiments. So after changing that, I ran the application again and finally saw some data. So next thing to do was add all 3 questions, and when you clicked on it, the bar chart would show the data for that particular question. For example, if you clicked on first question, you would see all positive, negative, and neutral responses for that for first question. And if you did that for second, you would see all positive, negative, and neutral responses for second question. I added all 3 questions and later made 3 methods: data change to first, data change to second, and data change to third. These methods will basically set the data so that bar chart shows the different stats depending on the question selected. In data change to first, I basically set state of label to negative, neutral, and positive, and set the data of the bar chart to first data set, so the chart would show stats for first question. I did the same for the rest of the other methods. Data change to second changed the data to second data set, and data change to third changed the data to third data set. Then I bound those methods in the constructor so React would know what methods were being called. So after that, next thing to do was to connect to Azure SQL and publish the application using Azure. After signing into Azure portal, I created an app service, associated it to my ReactJs temp resource group, gave it a name ReactJs Proto, and selected runtime stack to ASP.NET Core 3.1 since that's the one I was using. Selected the time zone to East US, and everything else is pretty straightforward. So along with app service, I had to create a SQL database in Azure since the application is using database as well. So I added SQL database, but in order to make the database, you also need to create a SQL server. It gives you an option to create a SQL server, so I created a new server, gave login name lival, and set the password. Not too sure if changing the server location to something different would cause error, but I left the location to East US, just the same as my app service. I then gave the database name ReactJs temp DB, brought the SQL storage to minimum because it's a small project, so it really doesn't require a lot of space. So next, I went back to my project. I right-click on the project and pressed publish. So in the publish window, I selected app service I had recently created, ReactJs temp. After that, I had to make sure I selected the option in data section. I also selected option under file publish option, as I did not want unnecessary copy of files to be stored. And under entity framework migrations, I selected the apply this migration on publish. This will basically transfer the migration from local project to Azure, and in that text field, the connection string of Azure SQL DB is needed. So back in my resource group, I opened my DB overview, and one of the important thing to do is to set up firewall setting. What you have to do is inside database firewall settings, turn the allow Azure services and resources to access the server to S. This way Azure can access your Azure database and will prevent database related error. Another important thing I did was copied the connection string of Azure database and went to my app service configuration and added a new connection string at the bottom. And I think the name of the string should be the same as the name of connection string in your project. You could try using different name, but in my experience it yielded to some errors while publishing. So anyway, I copied the connection string to my Azure SQL database and pasted it to the value next to the field and changed the type to Azure SQL. Saved it and refreshed it, and copied the Azure SQL database string in publish settings and pressed published. So after a few minutes, the application got published, and this is what end result looks like. I'll post a link to the actual project in the description down below. By the way, I'm open to any suggestions or critical criticisms you might have. Like I said before, this is not a tutorial, but if you have any questions regarding this application, feel free to ask me a question in the comment section or Twitter. I'll try my best to help you out. That being said, thank you for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.